Alright everyone, welcome to Cauneaus Arts. My name is shounak patwardhan and here's what we're going to do today. Paint brush strokes. Without any external files, third-party plugins or footages. Even the texture is created in the software. So this is 100% good old After Effects goodness served on a palette. Since we're talking about paintbrush strokes. And the best part, these are completely editable and customizable. Before we get to the tutorial, if you aren't subscribed to my channel, please do hit the subscribe button so you will receive all my future updates. And also consider pressing the notification icon. It isn't entirely necessary, but you might as well do it to receive a notification whenever I upload new stuff. And I upload new stuff all the time. So let's get to the fun things in life. Once you're in After Effects, go to Composition, New Composition. I'm gonna change this to 4000 by 2000 and frame rate can be 30. This can be anything you want, so press OK. Now instead of creating a solid layer, I can create a solid layer or a shape layer, which is this one. But instead of creating a solid layer, I'm going to go for a shape layer because having the shape layer gives me a certain control over the dimensions of this rectangle. I'll show it to you later how I can adjust the dimensions of this rectangle to change the size of the brush stroke. So for now, I'll just create a rectangle. If you double click on the rectangle here, it creates a rectangle which is equal to the dimensions of this comb. So currently this one is 4000 by 2000. Let's change the properties a little bit. By the way, if you need more double click tricks in After Effects, I do have another tutorial that I've created before, so if you want, I'll just leave a link to that tutorial in the description of this video so you can check it out anytime. Okay, after that shameless plug, let's move on. Unlink the size and change this to 3000 by 1000. Now before we create the stroke with all the distort effects, let's create the texture first. Go to layer, select your layer and go to effect, noise and grain, fractal noise. Now I've experimented with a few values in this tutorial overall, so I'm not going to spend too much time on actually experimenting in this tutorial just to save the time, because that can get a little bit boring and because it can drag a lot. So I have noted down a few of these values and I'm just going to use the same values throughout all the effects of this tutorial. You are free to use your own values, and altering these values can result in completely different kind of strokes. So yeah, just wanted to let you know that. Okay, so for this, change the noise type to block and the contrast will be 115. The brightness will be -38. Open up the transform and switch off uniform scaling, and the width will be 2170 and the height will be 34. While this does not look like a brush texture, we'll create some other effects and that will kind of remedy this. So let's move on. Go to effect and go to distort and click on turbulent displace. Change this to horizontal displacement and change the amount to 1367 and the size to 13, and change this anti-aliasing for best quality to high. The reason for this is very important. The reason for this is because if you switch on the transparency grid of this and if you zoom into this layer, you will see that if this is set at low, we kind of get these jagged edges. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see it in the video after I upload it on YouTube, but if you check it when you're working in After Effects, you get this aliased borders, which are not good, so change this to high. Of course, this will add a little bit of time to the rendering since this is higher quality. Okay, so I'm gonna collapse this. If you select and if you press Ctrl A on your keyboard to select everything, you can just collapse this entire stack. Let's duplicate the turbulent displacement that we have created. Let's leave this to horizontal displacement, but change the amount to 5440 and the size to 2. Rest everything remains the same. Duplicate it again by pressing Ctrl D on your keyboard and change the amount to 6500, the size to 8, and change the complexity on this one to 10. Now all of this brushstroke feels very boxy to me right now, like it's ending in approximately the same area. This is very rectangleish, so I'm just gonna give it a bit of a skew. So go to transform and change the skew axis to 90 degrees and the skew to 21. So we get a bit of a slanted brushstroke, which is cool. This is not a necessary thing, but I just didn't want it to be a very boxy shape. Okay, let's again collapse all of this and let's add another turbulent displacement. By the way, if you have your layer selected, if you double click on any effect, it'll get added to your layer stack at the very bottom of it. So for now, this displacement can be turbulent. Change the amount to 67 and the size to 1000. Duplicate it again. Yeah, I know, a lot of turbulent displacement effects, but that's what gives this kind of the distressed grunge feel. So okay, for the latest one, change the amount to 5.1 and the size to 12. Okay, collapse this as well. Now this is starting to look good, but I need a little bit of a color to this because this black and gray is just not working. So let's give it a tritone. And this can be any color you want. For now, I'm just going to go with a bit of a blue cyan kind of color. And for the shadows, you can just pick the midtones and darken them a little bit. Maybe it can be a bit, yeah, something like this. Okay, so we're already starting to get a nice brush stroke here. If you zoom in and look at the edges, they look very even and don't feel very natural. Like even with all the roughness, they're still a bit too smooth, if that makes any sense. So let's change that. There's a very cool effect called CC vector blur, and this is not used much. I've seen that a lot of places, like people, I don't know whether a lot of people even know this effect or not, but I use it sometimes and it gives very cool effects, so you should totally check it out sometime. Let's leave this to natural and change the amount to 109. Change the ridge smoothness to 7.4 and let's leave the vector map to none, but change the property to luminance and change the map softness to 2. Adding the vector blur also distresses the edges on the other sides. The sides were smooth earlier, so that kind of makes it look more interesting and real. This too is starting to feel a bit, you know, it doesn't feel very real, so let's add a bit of grain to this. change this to final output, and let's change the intensity to 2. If you open up color, and you can change this to monochromatic because I don't want any colors in it. This is starting to get a bit heavy since there were a lot of effects now. That is a fairly big stack. I'd like to add a little more of a distressed look to the edges, so let's add the roughen edges effect to this. Even this is kind of an interesting look, but not something that I'm looking for. Leave the edge type to roughen. Border, change this to 0. Edge sharpness 4.28. Fractal influence, reduce it to 0.5. And the scale to 48. And the complexity to 10. Okay. This is kind of a look that I was going for. Like, it has the right amount of distress on the sides and on the right and left as well. Like, this is the direction in which the brush stroke is going to be created. So this is not bad, but the lines are a bit too sharp, so maybe we can add a bit of blur to this. Add a Gaussian blur and change the blurriness to 1. That'll remove some of those dotted lines out there. So this is our brush stroke. Let's rename this comp to brush stroke 1. Now, as an additional tip, I'll also show you how to create a cool texture for this, to use the brush stroke on. What's a brush stroke without a texture and a background? Go to composition, new comp. 4000 by 2000 is cool. Create a solid layer, go to solid. This is fine. Go to effect, noise and grain, fractal noise. Change the fractal type to turbulent smooth, and let's leave the noise type to soft linear. Change the contrast to 108 and the brightness to 54. Open up transform and change the scale to 4.4. We're already starting to get a nice texture, but we're not done here. Let's add a tritone to it. Drag and drop it below the stack. Change the shadows to white as well, and the midtones can be slightly somewhere between yellow and orange and fairly desaturated. Okay, change the brightness and contrast of this a little bit. The brightness can be -3 and the contrast can be 100. To make this look a little bit more real, let's add some grain to it. Change the preview to final output, and the intensity on this can be 4.7, and the size 0.3. Remove the softness, we don't need it. Let's change it to 0. And for the color, this needs to be monochromatic as well, just like the last time. Now let's duplicate this solid and remove the grain and brightness contrast on it. And for this one, let's change the contrast on your fractal noise to 53 and the brightness to 0. And open up the transform and change the scale to 584. Let's duplicate this layer as well by pressing Ctrl D on your keyboard, and let's change the fractal type to rocky. Oh, by the way, the fractal type on this one will be smeary. And let's select both of these layers and change the mode to multiply. This is our cool looking texture. I'll just render this texture out as a separate file, and I'll leave a link to this texture as well in the description of this video, so if you want to use this texture you can go ahead and download it. Okay, let's change comp 1. Let's rename comp 1 to texture and drag it to a new composition. Also drag the brush stroke to the texture comp and change the mode to color burn, no, to linear burn. You can just check out these different modes. They all create an interesting look, so you can just go ahead and check them out. Now if you need to animate this brush stroke, we need to go back to the brush stroke layer and select the shape layer, and to animate the scale of this layer, go to the transform properties of the layer, and let's go to maybe 2 seconds on the timeline. Click on the stopwatch to add a keyframe to the scale property. But before we change this, if we need to animate this stroke from the left to right, we need the layer to scale from the left to right. To do that, we need to change the anchor point of this layer. If you press Y on your keyboard, it activates this pan behind tool, and if you change the anchor point and drag it very close to the left hand side of this layer, of the bounding box of this layer, be sure to not exceed this, because then if you scale the layer, it'll scale on the opposite side and not on this side. So the anchor point should not cross, should not actually move to the left of this bounding box created by this layer. Okay, so now that we have the anchor point in place, we can just unlink this, and the scale on the x-axis can be 0. So if you see the preview, you'll notice that it's moving at the same speed right from the start to the end. So let's change these keyframes to easy ease keyframes. If you press F9 on your keyboard, you can change these to easy ease keyframes, and even then I want it to start a little more smooth and probably ease in at the end as well. So select the keyframes and open up the graph editor, and if you select any of these keyframes, you can move these handles. So let's just make them snap a little more, and now if you preview this, now this feels a little more natural with its action. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I wanted this to be a shape layer and not a solid layer. The reason for this is if I change the properties of this rectangle, like if I reduce this, my brush stroke changes itself automatically. It does not get squeezed or stretched. If I change this, I can even change the length of this and make it a longer brush stroke. Of course, you'll have to change the anchor point again if this happens, because now it's kind of messed up. Let's undo this. So that is the reason why I wanted this to be a shape layer than a solid layer. And now if you also want to change some of the properties of the stroke, you can go to any of the effects in the effects stack here and play with the settings. For example, if I want to widen the distressed part of the stroke, I can change the amount on my first turbulent displace effect that I've added here. And you can do the same thing with any other effects here. There are a lot of effects, and every effect changes the stroke in a certain way, and you can get a lot of interesting looks with this. I'm just undoing it and redoing it, so you notice the difference between the two brush strokes. Also, at the very end, I would also like to show you a couple of interesting tricks with this vector blur effect. If you open this up and if you change this natural to constant length, you get different types of brush strokes just by changing this vector blur effect. you will get an altogether different type of brushstroke, and every look is kind of interesting and you can use it in different places. So even the vector blur changes a lot of these brushstroke properties, so just something to keep in mind. Here's the preview of the stroke we created today. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. Before you move on to other things, and if you aren't already subscribed to the Cauneaus Arts channel, do consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification icon, and don't forget to like and share the video. Shounak out for now.